All right, picture this. It's October 25th, 1854. You're a British cavalryman sitting on your horse, minding your own business, when your commanding officer, a guy who literally sleeps on a yacht in the harbor while you're freezing your butt off in a tent, rides up and says, "Right, lads, we're going to charge directly at those Russian cannons over there." And you're like, "Sir, those cannons are pointed at us." And he's like, "I'm aware." And you're like, "Sir, there are cannons on both sides of the valley too." And he's like, "Yep." And you're like, "So we're charging into a mile-long kill box with artillery on three sides?" And he goes, "That's the spirit. Now shut up and follow me. This is the charge of the Light Brigade. Folks, 673 cavalrymen charging straight into what one survivor called the greatest trap that ever was made. It's like if someone told you to run through a shooting gallery, except you're the target, you're on a horse, and the prize for making to the end is more people shooting at you. This wasn't war. This was a Renaissance painting titled, "What Happens When Aristocrats Play Army." The genius leaders. Let's meet our cast of characters, starting with the man who actually gave the order, Lord Raglan, the commander-in-chief of British forces in Crimea. Now, Lord Raglan was a 66-year-old general who had lost his right arm at Waterloo 40 years earlier, which would be inspiring if he hadn't spent those 4 decades basically doing paperwork. Dude was the military equivalent of your manager, who hasn't actually done the job in 20 years, but still insists on micromanaging everything. Raglan had this adorable habit of watching battles from hills 650 feet above the battlefield, like he was at the world's worst sporting event. From up there, he could see everything. The Russian positions, the Turkish redoubts, probably what everyone was having for lunch. But here's the kicker. Nobody down on the battlefield could see what he was seeing. So when Raglan wrote orders like, "Advance rapidly to front and prevent the enemy carrying away the guns," he forgot the tiny detail of specifying which guns. It's like texting your roommate, "Bring home the thing," and getting mad when they don't read your mind. Then we have Lord Cardigan, commander of the Light Brigade, and possibly the most punchable face in Victorian England. This man, and I'm using that term generously, was a 7th Earl who literally bought his way up the military ladder. While his men were sleeping in muddy tents and eating hardtack that could double his body armor, Cardigan was sleeping on his private yacht in Balaclava Harbor, complete with a personal chef. Every morning he'd ride up to his troops like, "Good morning, chaps. I had poached eggs and champagne for breakfast. How was your cold gruel?" Cardigan hated a superior officer, Lord Lucan, who commanded the overall cavalry division. Lucan was Cardigan's brother-in-law, which means they were forced to interact at family gatherings and on the battlefield, a recipe for disaster, if there ever was one. These two despised each other so much that they'd argue about everything from uniform buttons to which direction was forward. It was like putting 2 Karens in charge of an army. The Crimean War, aka why are we even here? So why were these clowns even in Crimea? Great question. The Crimean War was one of those conflicts where if you ask 10 historians why it started, you'll get 11 different answers. Basically, Britain and France decided they needed to protect the Ottoman Empire from Russia, not because they liked the Ottomans, but because they were terrified of Russia getting too powerful. It's the geopolitical equivalent of befriending someone you don't like just to annoy someone you like even less. The British Army showed up in Crimea in 1854 and immediately proved that they had learned absolutely nothing since the Napoleonic Wars ended 40 years earlier. The supply system was a joke. The medical care was basically rub some dirt on it. The command structure was so Byzantine that orders had to pass through 17 people before reaching anyone who could actually do anything. It's like if a corporation had a meeting about having a meeting about scheduling a meeting. The morning of the disaster. On the morning of October 25th, the Russians launched an attack near Balaclava, trying to cut off the British supply route. At 7:45 a.m., Lord Cardigan finally rolled up to his cavalry after presumably enjoying a light breakfast on his yacht. Meanwhile, Lord Raglan was already posted up on the Sapoun Heights, 650 feet above the action, with binoculars and probably some popcorn. The Russians were commanded by Pavel Liprandi, who had about 25,000 infantry, 4,000 cavalry, and 30 to 40 cannons. In other words, he brought an army to a knife fight. The British cavalry had, well, they had horses and vibes. And Lord Raglan's first order of the day? Cavalry to take ground to the left of the second line of redoubts occupied by the Turks, which is military speak for go stand over there and look pretty. But then, Raglan had second thoughts 30 minutes later and changed his order. 8 squadrons of heavy dragoons to be detached towards Balaclava to support the Turks who are wavering. My guy was playing RTS video game commands from 600 feet up, moving cavalry units around like chess pieces while having exactly zero communication with the people actually doing the fighting. The setup for stupidity. Now here's where it gets spicy. Earlier in the day, there had been another cavalry charge, the charge of the Heavy Brigade, which had actually worked. General James Scarlett's Heavy Brigade charged uphill into superior Russian cavalry and somehow won. It was glorious. It was unexpected. And it gave everyone involved a dangerously inflated sense of confidence. So when Raglan looked down from his sky throne and saw the Russians trying to haul away some captured British cannons, he had a brilliant idea. Send a light brigade to stop them. Light cavalry, the fast, lightly armed scouts, going after artillery positions. This is like sending a Honda Civic to stop a tank. But Raglan was confident. He could see the guns from his position. Surely everyone else could too. Colonel Richard Airy, Raglan's aide, scribbled down the order. Lord Raglan wishes the cavalry to advance rapidly to the front, follow the enemy, and try to prevent the enemy carrying away the guns. Troop horse artillery may accompany. French cavalry is on your left. Immediate. Notice what's missing? Any indication of which guns. Any sense of where to go. Any acknowledgement that this was a monumentally stupid idea. The order was handed to Captain Lewis Nolan, who rode down to deliver it to Lord Lucan and Lord Cardigan. And this is where you need to understand the geography. From a valley floor, the cavalry commanders couldn't see the guns Raglan was talking about. All they could see was a heavily defended valley with Russian artillery batteries at the far end and more Russian guns on the hills on either side. When Lucan read the order and asked Nolan which guns Raglan meant, Nolan, who was as arrogant as he was tragically about to become a statistic, gestured vaguely toward a valley and allegedly said something like, "There, my lord, is your enemy." It's the military equivalent of asking for directions, and someone pointing at the horizon and saying that way, except that way, was through 1.25 miles of overlapping artillery fire from 3 directions. Lord Lucan turned to Lord Cardigan and basically said, "Well, this is insane, but orders are orders. Take your 673 men and charge down that valley." And Cardigan, God bless his aristocratic, yacht-dwelling, champagne-sipping soul, looked at the valley, looked at his men, looked back at the valley and said, "Here goes the last of the Brudenells." But did he refuse the order? Did he ride back up to Raglan and say, "Sir, I think there's been a mistake"? Did he use literally any of the common sense God gave a particularly dim horse? Nope. He drew his sword, told his men to form up, and prepare to lead the most famous cavalry charge in history. Famous because it was so catastrophically, jaw-droppingly, mind-numbingly stupid that people are still talking about it 171 years later. The stage was set. The Valley of Death was waiting. And 673 men on horses were about to learn the hard way why you don't bring cavalry to an artillery fight. Red flag number 1. The terrain literally screams, "Don't do this." Let's talk about what the Light Brigade could actually see from their position on the valley floor. While Lord Raglan was up on his observation deck with a view so good, he could probably count individual Russian mustache hairs. The cavalry down below had the tactical awareness of someone wearing a blindfold in a corn maze. The North Valley stretched out in front of them for about 1.25 miles, and I want you to really picture this. With Russian artillery batteries positioned at the end of the valley, Russian guns on the Fedayukin Heights to their left, and more Russian guns on the Causeway Heights to their right. It was a shooting gallery designed by someone who really, really hated horses. If you were designing a place to send cavalry to die, you'd basically recreate this valley and then add some dramatic music. One of the officers, looking at the suicide corridor, allegedly said to his neighbor, "Well, here goes the last of the Brudenells," which is Victorian speak for "we're absolutely screwed." But did anyone say, "Hey, maybe we should reconsider this"? Nope, because in the British Army of 1854, questioning orders was more scandalous than showing up to church in your pajamas. Red flag number 2. The order made 0 sense. Let's revisit that beautiful disaster of a written order. Lord Raglan wishes the cavalry to advance rapidly to the front, follow the enemy, and try to prevent the enemy carrying away the guns. Now, Lord Lucan, who was many things, but not completely brain-dead, read this and was like, "What guns? Where? Which enemy? What are we talking about right now?" Because from where he was standing, there were no visible British guns being carried away. None. Zero. Zilch. The guns Raglan was referring to, the 12-pounder naval guns in the Turkish redoubts up on the Causeway Heights, were completely hidden from Lucan's view by rising ground. So Lucan turned to Captain Nolan, the messenger, and essentially said, "Bro, what are we supposed to attack?" And Nolan, who was apparently in a terrible mood that day, or just naturally had the personality of a wasp trapped in a jar, waved his hand dramatically toward the valley and snapped, "There, my lord, is your enemy. They're your guns." Let me be clear. Nolan was gesturing in the wrong direction. He was pointing at the Russian battery at the far end of the valley, not at the captured redoubts that Raglan actually wanted them to hit. It's like asking someone where the bathroom is, and they point you toward the highway. Except in this case, the highway is lined with cannons that want you dead. Lord Lucan later claimed he couldn't see any enemy or guns in the direction of the redoubts from his position. And you know what? He was probably right. The terrain blocked his view. So when Nolan pointed down the valley with all the subtlety of an angry Victorian gentleman having a tantrum, Lucan naturally assumed that was a target. Because what else was he supposed to think? Red flag number 3. Even Lord Cardigan knew this was insane. Lord Cardigan, champagne drinking, yacht sleeping, generally useless human Lord Cardigan, looked at the valley and actually had a moment of clarity. When Lucan told him to charge down that valley, Cardigan actually pushed back. He said, and I'm paraphrasing from the Victorian equivalent, "Sir, have you noticed there's a battery in front, a battery on each flank, and the ground is covered with Russian riflemen?" That's right. The guy who normally wouldn't notice danger if it was actively biting him looked at the situation and went, "This seems like a bad idea." When Lord Cardigan thinks something is too dangerous, you know you've entered truly spectacular levels of stupid. But Lucan just shrugged and said, "I cannot help that. It is Lord Raglan's positive order that the Light Brigade is to attack the enemy," which is military speak for, "Look, man, I know this is insane, but if I don't do it, the boss is going to be mad, so good luck out there." And Cardigan, because he was more afraid of looking like a coward than of being turned into Swiss cheese, saluted and said, "Certainly, sir." He then turned to his 673 men and prepared to lead them into what every single person present knew was a death trap. Red flag number 4. The heavy brigade wasn't coming. Here's something that should have been a massive warning sign. Earlier in the day, the heavy brigade had charged the Russians and actually won. It was awesome. They rode uphill, crashed into superior Russian cavalry, and somehow pulled it off. So you'd think that if the Light Brigade was about to do something equally dangerous, the Heavy Brigade would be right behind them for support, right? Wrong. Lord Raglan specifically ordered the Heavy Brigade to not follow the Light Brigade into the valley. He watched from his hill as the Light Brigade formed up, and apparently at some point his brain finally caught up to reality and he realized, oh no, they're charging the wrong guns. But did he send a messenger to stop them? Did he fire a signal? Did he do anything to prevent the disaster he could see unfolding? Nope. He just watched, like a guy watching his friend walk into a sliding glass door and not warning them, because he wants to see what happens. So the Light Brigade was going in alone without backup into a valley that was basically a cannon-line hallway of death. And everybody knew it. The launch. Well, here goes nothing. At approximately 11:15 a.m., Lord Cardigan gave the order to form up. The Light Brigade arranged themselves in 3 lines. The first line consisted of the 13th Light Dragoons and the 17th Lancers. The second line had the 11th Hussars. Behind them, the 4th Light Dragoons and the 8th Hussars brought up the rear. 673 men sat on their horses, looking down a mile-long valley toward Russian artillery that was actively being loaded with grape shot, which, by the way, is basically a cannon-fired shotgun blast designed to turn cavalry into ground meat. The sun was glinting off the Russian cannon barrels like they were waving hello. Captain Nolan, the messenger who had caused this whole mess with his vague hand gestures, positioned himself with the first line. Some historians think he realized a mistake and was trying to redirect the charge. We'll never know for sure, because, spoiler alert, Nolan was about to have a really bad day. Lord Cardigan sat at the front on his chestnut horse, looking very dashing and completely doomed. One witness later said that Cardigan rode with the same precision as if he were leading a parade, which is very on brand for a man who thought war was basically a sport where you kept score using corpses. The men sat there, waiting. Some of them were probably thinking about their families back home. Some were probably wondering if it was too late to fake a stomach ache. One guy was probably thinking, I cannot believe I'm about to die because some aristocrat pointed in the wrong direction. And then Cardigan raised a sword, looked back at his men one final time, and gave the order that would echo through history as one of the dumbest commands ever issued. The brigade will advance. Walk. March. Trot. They started moving, slowly at first, a walking pace, like they were going on a pleasant Sunday ride. The Russian gunners at the far end of the valley watched in what I can only imagine was complete confusion. Like, are these guys seriously coming toward us? On purpose. About 300 yards in, the pace increased to a trot. The horses' hooves kicked up dust. The jangling of sabers and equipment filled the air. And still, the Russian guns remained silent. They were probably waiting, thinking, there's no way they're this stupid. They must be a diversion for something else. The first shot, reality arrives with grape shot. At around 400 yards from the Russian battery at the end of the valley, the first cannon fired. The sound was absolutely earth-shattering. Then the guns on the left flank opened up, then the ones on the right. Within seconds, the entire valley erupted into what one survivor described as a blaze of fire. Cannonballs screamed through the air. Grape shot, clouds of metal balls designed specifically to shred cavalry, cut through formation like a demonic lawnmower. Horses started dropping. Men started dropping. The beautiful parade formation immediately turned into chaos. And Captain Nolan, the guy who had started this whole mess with his sarcastic hand gesture, one of the very first shots hit him directly in the chest. Witnesses said he let out a scream, dropped his sword, and rode back to the advancing lines, dead but still somehow in a saddle, before falling off. It was like the universe said, you know what? You first. But here's the thing. The Light Brigade didn't stop. They didn't turn around. They didn't even slow down. Because that's what British cavalry did. They followed orders, even when those orders were written by incompetent aristocrats watching from luxury skyboxes 650 feet away. Lord Cardigan, still at the front, still looking like he was leading a parade, increased the pace to a canter, then to a gallop. The men behind him followed, their training overriding every survival instinct screaming at them to turn around. 3 sides of the valley exploded with cannon fire. Russian riflemen on the slopes picked off cavalrymen one by one. Horses collapsed, sending their riders tumbling. Men were blown out of their saddles. The carnage was so intense that one officer later said, we were, in fact, surrounded and encircled by a blaze of fire. And they kept charging. The valley became a nightmare of smoke, blood, screaming horses, and continuous thunder of artillery. The British cavalry rode through it all, maintaining formation as best they could, because apparently dying in neat lines was more important than, not dying. They had committed to the charge. There was no turning back now. The Valley of Death had them, and the only way out was through the Russian guns at the far end. If they even made it that far, which, spoiler alert, most of them wouldn't, into the Valley of, oh no. So there they were, 673 of Britain's finest cavalrymen, galloping full speed down a 1.25 mile long corridor of absolute mayhem. The sound alone must have been apocalyptic. Cannon fire from 3 directions, horses screaming, men yelling, the constant whistle of grape shot cutting through the air like the world's worst wind chimes. Lord Cardigan, bless his oblivious heart, led from the very front on his horse Ronald, maintaining parade ground posture like he was riding to a garden party, and not into the literal definition of a kill zone. And here's the beautiful part. He never looked back. Not once. Cardigan rode that entire charge staring straight ahead, completely unaware that behind him, his brigade was being systematically deleted from existence. It's like being the driver in a car crash and not noticing that your entire backseat just exploded. This man had the situational awareness of a goldfish wearing sunglasses. The Russian gunners, meanwhile, were having the easiest day of their military careers. They didn't even have to aim, just point the cannons generally that way and pull the trigger. It was like shooting fish in a barrel, except the fish were on horses and the barrel was a mile long. One Russian artillery officer later said he felt bad about it. He felt bad. When your enemy feels sorry for you, you know things have gone spectacularly wrong. The meat grinder gets busy. As the Light Brigade galloped deeper into the valley, the casualties started mounting faster than a Black Friday sale. Men were falling out of their saddles left and right. Horses collapsed mid-stride, sending riders tumbling. The neat formation that had started the charge dissolved into chaos. The 13th Light Dragoons lost 69 men out of 130, a casualty rate of 53%. The 17th Lancers got absolutely shredded, losing 110 men out of 143, a mind-melting 77% casualty rate. To put that in perspective, that's worse odds than playing Russian roulette with 5 bullets in the chamber. But here's the truly insane part. They kept going, through the smoke, through the carnage, through what should have been every possible signal to turn around. The Light Brigade charged forward, because apparently the Victorian British military valued looking proper over not being turned into a statistic. 475 horses were sent to the Shadow Realm during this charge. 475. That's not a cavalry charge. That's a horse apocalypse. Witnesses said the valley floor became carpeted with fallen animals, creating obstacles that the following waves had to jump over or ride around. It was like a nightmare version of an equestrian course. The glorious moment they reached the guns, against all odds, and I mean all odds, some of the Light Brigade actually made it to the Russian battery at the end of the valley. They crashed into gun positions with their sabers and lances, engaging in hand-to-hand combat with the shocked Russian artillerymen who probably couldn't believe anyone had actually survived the gauntlet. For about 5 glorious minutes, the Light Brigade did what they were supposed to do. They wrecked that battery. Artillerymen fled. Guns were spiked. It was a brief moment of, hey, we're actually doing cavalry stuff. But then reality showed up like an angry parent at a house party. The Light Brigade looked around and realized, oh, wait, we're now behind enemy lines. We have no support. We're completely surrounded, and everyone who could help us is either dead, dying, or a mile away back where we started. The Russian cavalry, seeing that this small group of British madmen was isolated and outnumbered, did what any sensible army would do. They surrounded them and prepared to cut off their retreat. Meanwhile, the Russian artillery that the Light Brigade had just charged through? Yeah, those guys came back to their guns and started loading again. The moment of realization. This is where the tactical genius really shines. Folks, Lord Cardigan, having led the charge and somehow made it through the Russian positions without a scratch, looked around and went, huh, where's everyone? My dude, you just led 673 men down a shooting gallery, and you're wondering where they went? It's like setting your house on fire, and then being confused about why it's warm. Cardigan, realizing that hanging around behind Russian lines alone was probably not the strategic masterstroke he'd hoped for, turned Ronald around and rode back through the valley, again, without looking at the absolute carnage he'd created. He was one of the first to make it back to British lines, where he encountered General Cathcart and allegedly said, I have lost my brigade. He said it like someone who just misplaced their car keys. Whoops. Seems I've lost 600 men. Has anyone seen them? They were just here a minute ago. Meanwhile, the survivors who were still trapped at the far end of the valley were fighting for their lives. They had to break through Russian cavalry, dodge Russian artillery fire from multiple directions, and ride back through the same deadly corridor they just charged down. Except now it was even more dangerous because the Russians had had time to reload and were really mad. The retreat, the sequel nobody asked for. The retreat was somehow even worse than the charge. The survivors had to run the same gauntlet in reverse, except this time they were scattered, exhausted, and the Russians knew exactly where they were. The artillery on both flanks opened up again. The riflemen on the hillsides picked off stragglers. It was less a military retreat and more of a desperate sprint for survival. Captain Godfrey Morgan, one of the survivors, later described riding back through a rain of shot and shell, which is Victorian speak for everything was exploding, and I thought I was going to die. Men whose horses had been shot out from under them tried to run back on foot, which, in case you're wondering, is not a great strategy when you're wearing full cavalry gear and people are shooting cannons at you. Some were captured, some were shot, some just collapsed from exhaustion. It was a complete disaster wrapped in a catastrophe tied with a bow made of incompetence. By the time the survivors straggled back to British lines, the mounted strength of the Light Brigade, meaning dudes who still had horses, was 195 out of the original 673. That's a survival rate of about 29%. For context, that's worse than the Titanic. The total butcher's bill? 113 men sent permanently to the Shadow Realm, 134 wounded, and about 60 captured. That's a 40% casualty rate. 40% in approximately 25 minutes of combat. To put this in perspective, modern military theorists consider anything over 25% casualties to be a unit-destroying event. The Light Brigade sailed past that mark like it was suggestion. This wasn't a battle. It was organized self-checkout. The French observer sums it up. French General Pierre Bosquet watched the whole thing from a nearby position, and when it was over, he delivered one of the most devastating critiques in military history. C'est magnifique, mais ce n'est pas la guerre. Translation: it's magnificent, but it's not war. In other words, that was very brave and very stupid, and I cannot believe I just watched you guys do that. The French, were making fun of how badly the British had screwed up. When the French are roasting your military tactics, you know you've hit rock bottom and started digging. Bosquet's quote is a Victorian equivalent of watching someone walk into a wall and saying, "That was impressive commitment to walking forward. But maybe look where you're going next time." Lord Raglan finally notices. Up on his observation hill, Lord Raglan watched the charge unfold and apparently experienced what we in the modern era call a Brum moment. According to witnesses, as the Light Brigade disappeared into the smoke and carnage, Raglan turned to his staff and basically went, "Wait, they're charging the wrong guns." Yes, Lord Raglan. Yes, they are. Maybe, and I'm just spitballing here, you should have been more specific in your orders? Maybe include details like which guns, and not the ones at the end of the valley surrounded by more guns. But Raglan didn't send anyone to stop the charge. He didn't fire signal guns. He just watched as his vague order resulted in the most famous cavalry disaster in history. It's like texting someone bring food, and then being surprised when they show up with gas station sushi. After the battle, Raglan had the audacity to be upset with Lord Lucan for misinterpreting the order. "My brother in Christ, your order had more holes in the Light Brigade after they rode through that valley." Taking responsibility was apparently not a skill they taught at 19th century British military academies. The aftermath on the ground. Back on the actual battlefield, the scene was absolutely devastating. The valley floor was littered with fallen men and horses. The survivors were in shock, many of them wounded, all of them traumatized. Some soldiers wandered around in a daze, looking for their comrades. Others just sat down and stared at nothing. Medical care in 1854 was barely better than "here's a rag, good luck." Wounded men were loaded onto carts and taken to field hospitals where the doctor's main tools were saws and prayer. Many men who survived the charge ended up taking a permanent nap from their wounds in the weeks that followed. The horses that were too wounded to save were put down right there on the field. The sound of pistol shots continued long after the cannons had stopped firing. It was a tragic period at the end of a sentence written by incompetent leadership. Sergeant Frederick Peake was one of the survivors who got hit by cannon fire during the charge, suffering a broken arm that would affect him for the rest of his life. Like many Crimean War veterans, he would later need to seek charitable support because apparently Britain's gratitude for suicidal bravery didn't extend to actual financial assistance. The cover-up begins. Almost immediately, the spin machine started working overtime. Rumors circulated that Lord Cardigan hadn't actually led the charge, that he'd hung back and avoided danger. This was completely untrue. Cardigan had led from the front and had simply been incredibly lucky. But the rumor persisted because everyone hated him so much they wanted to believe he was both incompetent and cowardly. Lord Lucan and Lord Cardigan immediately started blaming each other. Lucan said the order was unclear and Cardigan had charged the wrong target. Cardigan said Lucan had given him explicit instructions. Both of them blamed Captain Nolan, who had the good fortune of being too dead to defend himself. Lord Raglan blamed Lucan for misunderstanding the order. Lucan blamed Raglan for writing a terrible order. Cardigan blamed everyone except himself because taking responsibility would have required self-awareness, which he did not possess. It was a Victorian version of a circular firing squad, except they were using words instead of bullets, which, honestly, is more than can be said for their battle strategy. The British public, reading about the charge in newspapers back home, somehow turned this catastrophic blunder into a tale of heroic bravery. The poet Alfred Lord Tennyson wrote The Charge of the Light Brigade, romanticizing the whole disaster into 6 stanzas of There's not the reason why, there's but to do and die, which, sure, sounds inspirational until you realize the message is basically don't question obviously suicidal orders. It's like writing a motivational poster that says, follow your dreams, but the dream is running into traffic. The Light Brigade had charged into Valley as 673 trained cavalrymen, representing the elite of British military horsemanship. They returned as 195 shell-shock survivors of what should have been an avoidable disaster. And the worst part? The guns they were originally supposed to capture, the ones on the causeway heights at Raglan had actually meant, were never retaken. The whole thing was pointless. They had charged. They had suffered. They had died. And they had accomplished absolutely nothing except creating the most famous example of military incompetence in modern history. Battle over. Brains still missing. With the last echo of cannon fire and the appalling vision of the Valley of Death still burning in everyone's retinas, the Light Brigade limped, or rather, whatever sadder than limping, back to British lines. Of the 673 overly optimistic horsemen that charged, only 195 came back with something resembling a horse. The rest? Permanent nap, or unplanned foot soldier career. About 118 men bought the farm outright. Another 127 were wounded. 60 or so got themselves a free vacation to Russian prison camps. And somewhere between 375 and almost 500 horses were permanently off the British payroll. It was the kind of performance review where the only promotion you get is to the afterlife. But hey, at least they inflicted a whopping 180 casualties on the Russians. That's less than the number of horses the British lost. The word Pyrrhic wishes it could describe this disaster. It's jealous of the sheer magnitude of this L. Who got toasted? Who got toast points? So, naturally, this catastrophic display of leadership had to be someone's fault. Quick refresher. Orders were unclear. Everyone miscommunicated. And Lord Cardigan was so committed to front that he rolled back from the charge before anyone else, conveniently avoiding the whole dying with his troops thing. Let's break down the post-game show. Lord Raglan, the grand architect of confusion, Mr. Attack the guns, but not those guns. Did he apologize? Of course not. Did he get sacked? Nah. In true upper crust fashion, Raglan kept his job right up until he unalived by natural causes about a year later, his incompetence never actually catching up with his career. Lord Lucan, Cardigan's loving brother-in-law, noted, do what you're told, even if it's dumb, enthusiast. He was sent home in disgrace. His career shadowed for life. But get this. The British Army quietly brought him back years later and promoted him to Field Marshal. Yes, you read that right. You can't fire a guy for a mistake so grand it becomes national myth. That's basically a resume boost. Lord Cardigan, Captain Yacht, he led from the front, lived to tell about it, and returned to England to a hero's welcome, fancy parades, and an army of admirers. Never mind, he left his men behind and treated the charge like a quick trip, to fetch the morning newspaper. He got promoted, awarded, and even landed a seat in Parliament. This is the original fail-up story. Captain Lewis Nolan, the hand-flailing messenger. He unalived so quickly in the charge that, predictably, the rest of the cast dumped every ounce of blame on his grave. Classic military tradition. If the guy who can't defend himself started the mess, it's his problem forever. For the actual heroes, soldiers who survived the charge, most returned to poverty, their war wounds, and a lifetime of that ridiculous thing you did? Yeah, we wrote a poem about it. The government's compensation? Let's just say it was about as generous as the order that sent them into the valley, not generous at all. By the turn of the century, at least 6 survivors were living in workhouses. One, Samuel Parks, won the Victoria Cross and still died broke in a pauper's grave. Cover up? PR spin machine engaged. Within minutes of the last survivor crawling out of the valley, everyone with a sword and a monocle started rewriting history in real time. Lucan claimed Cardigan misunderstood him. Cardigan claimed he wasn't allowed to interpret anything. Raglan said they all misread a perfectly clear order. That was about as clear as a foggy bathroom mirror after a hot shower. The British public, meanwhile, collected the disaster, polished it, attached a Union Jack, and paraded it as glorious sacrifice. Alfred Lord Tennyson cranked out a poem in record time, effectively turning horrific mismanagement into an anthem of unquestioning devotion. Ours is not a reason why. Ours is but to do and die. If that's not Victorian corporate culture, I don't know what is. Just to cap this off, the French Marshal Pierre Bosquet, who watched the whole mess, delivered the high society mic drop. It is magnificent, but it is not war. In other words, it was a fireworks show, but only because everyone involved forgot how matches work. Historians roast the ultimate grill. Let's be very clear about what we just witnessed. This wasn't elite heroism. This was a group of amateur magicians pulling defeat out of certain victory. This was an event where the biggest risk wasn't the enemy, but the friendly side's command chain. Every single elite quality is exposed as Victorian cosplay. The Light Brigade's reputation for discipline? They charged headlong because not one officer wanted to be that guy who asked for clarification. The great British tradition of gentlemanly order? They misread the map, misread the order, misread each other's faces, and, let's be honest, probably misread the lunch menu. And the piece de resistance, the leadership managed to hit the entire how-to-fail bingo card. Vague orders, zero situational awareness, ego battles, and a refusal to listen to anyone but their own echoes. It's not a miracle anyone charged. That would require divine intervention. The real miracle is that any of them made it home. If you're looking for a moment in military history to teach your kids how not to manage a crisis, this is it. If the armed forces handed out Darwin Awards, the entire top British command at Balaclava would be cleaning house every year. Epic fails. The tradition lives on. But hey, history is full of teachable moments, and you've just survived one. Want to avoid making the same fatal mistakes in your own life? Don't blindly follow questionable orders. Ask questions. Speak up. And if your boss ever gestures vaguely and says, go attack that, maybe, just maybe ask, are you sure, before you end up in your own valley of death. So, hit that subscribe button. Destroy the like button with all the enthusiasm of a misplaced cavalry charge. And share this video with someone whose group chats need more sarcasm and less tactical blunder. Trust me, this channel is the only place you'll get war stories with more roast than a barbecue and less ego than a Victorian officer fresh off his yacht. Because those who do not learn from the charge of the Light Brigade are doomed to repeat it, probably on camera. Don't charge the cannons without us. Subscribe now and make smarter history.